Hello and welcome to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to dive into the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine again and utilize a paper that is in the current issue. So I'm not going to be displaying this on the screen because once again, my hope is that you'll be able to engage and go find the paper, look at it yourself. Realistically, you're not going to find the full paper unless you have proper access. You're going to find the abstract so you can look at it. But again, I am definitely reading from the abstract. I'm not reading the full paper. The point of reading the abstract is to let you know that there are certain things that you can figure out. And I want to use this paper as a demonstration of where certain assumptions can go wrong. Or within the context, it can look like everything's fine, but there are flaws in those assumptions. So the paper is Evidence of Anchoring Bias in Novice First-Year Osteopathic French Students in the Context of the Primary Respiratory Mechanism, a Randomized Experimental Study. The abstract, so I'm going to read here. Cognitive biases appear to be one of the most common issues of incorrect medical diagnosis. It affects students during their training and could persist after post-graduation. This could deteriorate patient care. Among them, anchoring bias can impair haptic perception and lead to a biased diagnosis. So essentially, one of the things that they're saying is that they're saying if you have a thought in your head that overrides what is happening in observable reality, it can mess with what your interpretation of it is. I have said this many times, so I think there is a value in this point. But they are starting off by saying cognitive biases appear to be one of the most common causes of incorrect medical diagnosis. If you say that, you are assuming that cognitive biases are a thing that the person making them can detect. Right? If you look into medical diagnostic literature or diagnostic reasoning, what you will find is that many people were using the two-process model or the dual-process model, the Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky model of System 1 and System 2, thinking fast and thinking slow. That just isn't likely there. More likely than not, the primary source of error in medical diagnosis is not knowing. So if you have a novice or people at the novice level and they diagnose faster, they're more accurate because they know more. Or at least that's what it actually seems like. So when you know more stuff, you can be more accurate. You can make less errors. Expertise is highlighted by this, essentially knowing more. So cognitive bias is a mistake in thinking that somebody doesn't know they're making. So if you start off from that position, you already have a flaw built into everything that you're going to do. So I'm not criticizing these people for doing what they did. I'm saying that they don't know what a cognitive bias is as far as the cognitive psyche of it. These people just don't know enough, and then they're going to make assumptions because they don't know enough. So they're going to talk about people who don't know enough, and they don't know enough, right? Again, it's not a criticism. Within the framework of what they did fine. But there is other information. Okay? The objective, to read again. Our study assessed the anchoring bias of first-year osteopathic students by determining whether information regarding the PRM rhythm could influence their haptic perception. Okay? The methods. 40 first-year osteopathic students were randomly assigned to 3 groups. They were given different anchoring values during a PRM rhythm evaluation. 3, 10, or 17 movements per minute. All information were given through video documents. Perceived rhythms were collected before and after anchoring. Wilcoxon and Kruskal-Wallis tests used to compare intra and intergroup values. Nothing really wrong with the methods to assess what they're attempting to assess. That's a totally fine method within the context. Results. Before receiving the anchor, groups significantly, P of 0.105. Yeah, fair enough. I don't know if that's as significant as I would want it to be, but whatever, that's fine. Perceived the same rhythms, 11.8 plus or minus 6.6 movements per minute, 20.9 plus or minus 9.9 movements per minute, 18.2 plus or minus 10.6 movements per minute. That's a lot of difference, respectively, with high variance among students. After receiving the anchor, students perceived significantly different rhythms, 3.5 plus or minus 1.7, 11.4 plus or minus 2.8, 60.8 plus or minus 6.6, respectively. P 0 greater than 0 or less than 0.0001. Variance decreased significantly. Okay, so the first thing that you should note is that high degree of variance in the reported perception of cerebrospinous fluid, or the primary respiratory mechanism, however you want to talk about it. That high degree of variance is exceptionally important to acknowledge. That degree of variance within a group that has a particular kind of value means that there is a phenomena that's being reported that is unstable. Now, people are different, so you could simply ascribe it to the fact that people are different, that this PRM would be a very different rate. Or you could say that maybe it's not a thing and that they're sensing something else. From this, you can't really say much, but you can say it's conspicuous. That degree of variance within a group is very high. Then the reduction in variance that they note once the anchoring value is provided is a very interesting phenomenon. It is not necessarily a cognitive, it is a cognitive bias because it's a mistaken thinking that the people don't know they're making, but it's probably better described as an error because of thinking with the details that they have available to them. So they're correctly thinking with the details they were taught, okay? So I will read the conclusion here. An anchoring bias might occur among first-year osteopathic students regarding the perception of the PRM rhythm. These results provide insights into the importance of the way presenting information to students, especially controversial ones. Indeed, the way in which changing the ontological framework can modify the epistemological approach needs to be investigated. This could have implications on a student's clinical diagnosis. Students are encouraged to believe in their haptic ability, but also to use critical thinking. So there are interesting words here. Ontology. In science, ontology is the classification system that you use to describe things in their own right and compare things between one another such that there are multiple categories and you can identify where they're the same and where they're different, because when you identify where they're different, that's the category that you would zoom in on. Epistemological, to go back to, so the ontological framework, they say, can modify the epistemological approach. So the ontological framework philosophically is the view of reality. The view of reality, what you believe is the most real. Is it ideas that are the most real, or physical shared reality, objects, material, right? So are you an idealist or a materialist? Can modify the epistemological approach. Epistemology is a theory of knowledge, or a theory of knowledge creation, or a theory of truth. You have to have a view of reality, what is the most real, before you can have an epistemology, right? Because an epistemology is answering the questions, what can be known, how can it be known, and who can it be known by? You have to have a view of reality. So that's totally fine the way they put that together. And they're noting that depending on the ontological framework, the view of reality that you use, it can influence how students perceive what they feel. That is an important statement. This could have implications on a student's clinical diagnosis. Students are encouraged to believe in their haptic ability, but also use critical thinking, okay? They can't use critical thinking outside of the details that you provide. So this paper does note, especially on controversial topics, such as the primary respiratory mechanism, how you present this will influence how they interpret what they're feeling. Also, it suggests that they're probably just going to report that they're feeling something close to what you told them they should. Okay? Now, what is actually happening here in all likelihood is the students are thinking with the details they are provided. That relates well to the point in this paper that how you present really matters. It really, really matters. If you present from a place of certainty that a particular thing is happening, if you present the cultural story that has been transmitted throughout the profession that tells people about particular things, that is provably and observably wrong, then you will get that recreation across time as cultural transmission. I noted this in a previous podcast. I've noted this in many ways, many times. From a cognitive psych perspective, thinking depends on the details that are available. Therefore, if you tell them a particular range, they will probably report something close to that range. The variance will change. When they're just paying attention to their hands, the variance is high. That is a superficial cue that there is something funky about the PRM, or the primary respiratory mechanism concept, especially in actual observed shared reality. There's something interesting, unique, strange to be investigated about it. To be fair, it's not a thing. It's not observable. It's just not a thing. There are so many problems with so much of the research that attempts to claim that it's a thing, that on its face, at face validity, you can literally throw it out. The PRM is junk. It's absolute junk. The closest thing you're going to get to it is normal respiratory rate, which depending on the person is probably between 8 and 15 cycles per minute. So 8 and 15 cycles per respiratory cycles per minute. And then you overlay the PRM, and depending on who you look at, it's like 10 to 13 or whatever. It's right in the normal range of thoracic respiration. So like there's a more parsimonious explanation to this. That is just normal breathing. And because the person's laying on their back and they're breathing, there's normal motion transmitted from their thorax through their neck to their head, and that's what you find. Depending on where else you may be palpating, because the PRM can be palpated anywhere. It's breathing, right? It's a normal rhythmic motion that has variance between people and variance within the same person. So there's a much more parsimonious explanation. My general argument to work or to acknowledge that the environment of observation in all hands-on therapeutics is external to the body. You cannot see the internal processes. Is because what we're looking for, or what I would think would be valuable to look for, is the most parsimonious explanation. The principle of parsimony is a principle that directs people to use the explanation for an observation that assumes the least and explains the most. The moment you use an internal process when you are external to the body, you are assuming more. The deeper cognitively that you go into the body or into physiology, the more you are assuming from that external environment of observation. The most parsimonious way to deal with hands-on manual therapy is to stay outside of the body and note what you can observe. You can observe motion, you can observe restrictions in motion, you can observe variances in motion. You can observe those things, apply an intervention, and observe the change through the same diagnostic process. But the moment you ascribe any internal meaning to it, you are violating the principle of parsimony. Now, the principle of parsimony isn't always the best thing, but it's a really useful thing most of the time. The principle of parsimony always also allows for, in future, when considering the same phenomenon, that there may be an explanation that assumes less and explains more, or just assumes less but explains the same amount as the current explanation, or assumes the same amount and explains more, or assumes less and explains more than current, right? You can have multiple changes in it, but it always allows the opportunity for that to happen, because you need to be open to the reality that in current times we have a certain ability to observe things, and in future times we may have a better ability to observe things and explain things. So we can then assume less and explain more. So generally, behavior is well guided by minimizing your assumptions. If you're outside of the patient, you can observe movement, you can observe restriction, and you can observe changes in those things subsequent to intervention. So my suggestion that we minimize the stories that we tell about any internal processes is because I'm attempting to advocate for and follow the principle of parsimony, which allows for better explanations in the future. I freely admit that the approach that I'm taking is the best that I've got now based on the best interpretation I have of information. It doesn't mean it's the objective best. It's the best that I've got. If I continue to use that framework, then I can have the opportunity to continue to update my understanding. If we follow that, then our interventions have a better opportunity to work as best they can in the environment of observation that we have, being, again, external to the patient. There's a lot of redundancy in this because it matters. The mechanism of action of a treatment matters less than whether or not you can identify from the outside of the patient what is happening and then identify consistently a particular approach that ends up leading to change with that thing that you've observed. So really diving in for the mechanisms is interesting for, cognitive competition, for lack of a finer way to say this. Sometimes it's just mental masturbation. It doesn't make a difference. What makes a difference is if you can control the phenomenon from the environment that you find it. We do not find anything about the patient internal. We find proxy cues to internal stuff. Those proxy cues for hands-on therapists are really important for red flags and contraindications. Above and beyond that, they don't matter that much. The mechanism doesn't matter. So my refrain to pull back to that external environment of observation is one that is attempting to help all hands-on professions situate themselves in a place where they could better get a handle on the phenomena that they're dealing with, which is really movement and movement restriction and restoration of movement restriction. So really get a good handle on it of how to identify when it's going to work, who it's going to work for, and what are the best ways to do it. Once you do that and you handle that, you can really get a good handle on the phenomenon of identifying movement restrictions, intervening, and identifying change. Once you can get there, then there may be more value in understanding the mechanism because you have something to explain. Prior to being able to manage that phenomenon of working external to the patient, identifying movement restriction, intervening with it in a predictable way, and getting a predictable range of results and identifying change, prior to being able to do that, you have no mechanism to look for because your work is probably trash. It's untrustworthy, it's unreliable, it's probably got an invalid explanation attached to it. So don't bother. But following the principle of parsimony, you're external to the patient. Your explanation should stay there. The moment you dive internal to the patient, into physiology, you're making more assumptions. And every concept that you build on top of that assumption set will be populated with that assumption set and the flaws with them. Many people are not aware in any way of the assumptions that had to be made or how they were made for concepts that they used to guide them. They weren't there to see it. They weren't there to do it. They take it for granted because cultural transmission occurred. Cultural transmission is an education process. It's the transmission of details that guide behavior. So in education, what this article suggested is a good idea. Be very careful because you can skew somebody's reporting of a physical phenomenon, even though the physical phenomenon that they're using isn't a thing. It's just breathing. It's just thoracic respiration at best. At worst, it's just something you're completely making up to satisfy your teacher, who is clearly smart, and you want them to believe that you're smart. So, maybe trash that. But instead of having the explanations, zoom way back out to find the movement problem, intervene with the movement problem in a predictable way to get a predictable change and be able to identify that change. If you can do that, then you might have more reason to look for a mechanism. We have some mechanisms that are highly plausible, especially with osteopathy. We're probably really, as far as we can tell, mostly avoiding muscle spindle activation with smooth movements, no major accelerations or decelerations, and working primarily perpendicular to fiber direction because muscle spindles work within fiber direction or changes in length and changes in speed in fiber direction. So osteopathy is probably best explained as we understand it now as mediated by muscle spindles, whereas maybe others, let's say chiropractic, might be better explained by GTO, right? So they move so fast that the muscle can't spasm to protect. So it's an assumption. Those are both assumptions, but with what I'm aware of, those may be the ones that are most appropriate. Physiotherapy, I don't know, right? Like I can't tell you, but again, work. So come back to the principle of parsimony, work in the environment that you're in, get that handled, and then maybe you can look deeper. So this paper did a decent job of allowing me to get into that topic with an example. So hopefully you learned something from that, and we'll talk again soon.